The gospel story is a story of where our fears of abandonment are ultimately met in Jesus, right? That Jesus has overcome abandonment by going through abandonment, by going through the cross. And so that's to me, that's just a fascinating and interesting and gripping story, which ultimately gets to, I think, the answer to anxiety, which is that, the answer to anxiety is not that we medicate it away or we just pray it away. But the answer is by going through it, by actually going through anxiety as an experience of where we encounter our fears of abandonment and actually meet Jesus in it, not away from it or not around it, but in it, in our actual fears. And that's really a lot of what my new book, The Anxiety Opportunity, which is going to be coming out in May 15th. And listeners can go on Amazon now, actually, and pre-order it. But that's what that book is really about, is trying to engage the current narrative around anxiety and retell that story as actually it's a story where it's not a story that takes us away from God, but actually where we meet God through Jesus.
The opening clip you just listened to is Dr. Curtis Chang joining the Disciple Dilemma to talk about issues like anxiety and abandonment and the fears that face all Christians, all disciples, all followers of Christ in the world. Curtis has a new book out, The Anxiety Opportunity. That's weird, and we're going to talk about it. He's got another book, Engaging Unbelief, which is a great book we want to talk about. He's got a paper on the street called the D-Combinator, modeled after the Y Combinator venture capital investment name in Silicon Valley. And this one has to do specifically with how churches build discipleship. We want to talk about that. Let's listen to Curtis as he talks to us. Here we have a professor, a pastor, an author, a podcaster, who is a consultant. He's founded Redeeming Babel. We'll hear more about that as well. And Curtis will be able to talk to us, I think, in a straightforward way about the world of a pastor who's had to face the challenges of discipleship and the lack of discipleship in many places. Raymond and I are on this one. We want to really get a download from Dr. Curtis Chang, so stay with us, and here comes the interview. Well, first of all, I want to thank Raymond for joining us from Washington, D.C. in a hotel room with an internet connection that I hope hangs in there. Thanks, Raymond.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks, Dennis.
And professor and pastor and InterVarsity campus leader and a fellow who has been an author and a podcaster, Curtis Chang, thank you for joining us on the Disciple Dilemma.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Curtis, it's a delight to meet you. It's wonderful to have heard some of your stuff. I was driving through Texas and had about 6 or 7 hours, so I've listened to you at some extent, you and David French. And so how did you come to how did the idea originate that these two rather dense tomes of theology were really a narrative?
I think it's because, from my ministry experience, honestly, is because I'm fundamentally somebody who does my academic work out of an experience of ministry and discipleship. And you realize that human beings actually do not process their lives through broad, abstract principles. They actually process their lives through stories. They tell stories about their life. They make sense of their lives through stories. And the scriptures are ultimately one big story that God chose to reveal himself, not by skywriting 3 principles, in the sky, but by rather telling a grand story that began with creation, that has all the classic chapters of creation, fall, Israel, exile, Jesus, the cross, resurrection, ultimate restoration in his return. And so, the gospel is a story. That's what it is. And it's a story, a big story that makes sense of all of our little stories, the little stories of our lives. And our little stories only have ultimate meaning to the extent that they find themselves located in the larger story. And so I think it's because I was doing ministry and realizing this is how people make sense of their lives. And so it occurred to me that both the Gospels was not only the gospel was a narrative, but that a lot of our great thinkers in church history really were operating with narrative frameworks to their work. And it's really only later commentary that has tried to reduce them to abstract principles. And so I was trying to recover in Engaging Unbelief this underlying narrative structure to these two great thinkers, Augustine and Aquinas, and showing how they were really ultimately trying to retell the story of their day and age in that larger biblical narrative.
How do you think we begin to reframe the current epical story in a way that we can show that it points to a bigger story and that the bigger story is really that biblical narrative?
Yeah, I think the thing that, I write about in my book, the first thing you have to do is establish a right to actually tell the other person's story or retell the other person's story, right? So you have to show that you actually understand their story. You understand how they are making sense of the world before you try to tell give you your own story, which, presumably is the gospel story. And so this is an act of deep empathy and hard work at understanding what the others is, not just picking out their flaws and saying, here's where your story is wrong, which is what I think, when we think about evangelism, we so quickly jump to that, like, oh, let me critique the other person's story. You have to do the hard work of making sure you understand the other person's story, and you can tell it in a way that the other person hears and says, oh yeah, no, that's right. That's you've got it. You're actually named how I look at the world, how I view the beginning, the middle, and the end of my story. And before you can try to share your story. And so this takes work. This takes actually identifying some key elements. And I think one of the key ways that you can tell the other person's story right is when you can identify and articulate the deep longing in the other person's story. That stories are about longing. Stories are about this is basic to any narrative structure, right? Is you have the character, the hero, that longs for something. And that longing animates that entire story. And so when you talk about our current social, narratives of like justice or community or acceptance, what is the underlying longing there? And can we describe it in a way that people are like, yeah, you've named it, you've nailed it. And only after that, then do you earn the right to tell. And this is the key thing, is then that doesn't actually, the next step after that is not, well, let me tell you the gospel story now. It's you have to be able to narrate that story, and then to be able to narrate it in a way that identifies where that story in its own way, in its own merits, doesn't actually pay off, falls short, so that for example, that the contemporary narrative for social justice, as much as it longs for justice, where are ways in which that narrative doesn't pay off? Because ultimately, I think what the current social justice narrative ultimately wants is a just society. But its only way of getting there is by sort of, in a sense right now, I would say punishing the unjust, right? Is identifying, critiquing, and punishing and canceling or overturning or smashing the patriarchy or whatever version it is. It's ultimately doesn't have a vision of how the unjust gets restored to relationship with those that they have been oppressing, for instance, right? So that justice is not just eliminating or correcting the oppressor. Justice is making right. That's ultimate what justice is the ultimate making right of what is wrong. And there's a missing element in the sort of social justice narrative of like, is there a making right that actually includes the restoration of the unjust? Other than a canceling or punishing and overthrowing and so forth. And this is where I think if we can elicit and evoke that deeper longing that we have for, I don't want to just have a story that eliminates the bad guys. Deep down, is there a story in which the bad guys are actually made right? And I as presumably the good guy in the story, and brought back into relationship with the bad guy. Like that's a story, right? Like that's a story that if you can actually tell as the gospel story, the story in which the bad guy is brought into relationship, then you've got a story there.
And that's fascinating because, of course, I listened to some of your podcasts and you talked about anxiety and the new book you have coming up on anxiety. And when we've talked to other people, they've identified in our current culture, especially the younger generation, three primary things that are really of concern. One is, what's the meaning of my life? The second is, what community can give me identity? And the third is the subject of your book, anxiety. I'm anxious. And it seems to me one of the sources of anxiety is, how do I know that I'm not the bad guy? And that Christian story really is about forgiveness and redemption. So wouldn't we, and this is just a proposal, wouldn't we really try to have the sort of thematic thing would be about redemption and forgiveness in terms of justice rather than punishment and abandonment?
No, I think that's right. I mean, look, ultimately, I think the deep anxiety that we all have is that we're going to be abandoned, that we're going to be left alone. That is the existential anxiety that is underneath a lot of all, sort of more surface anxieties. And I think that is the hook into the anxiety story is
Sure.
The gospel story is a story of where our fears of abandonment are ultimately met in Jesus, right? That Jesus has overcome abandonment by going through abandonment, by going through the cross. And so that's to me, that's just a fascinating and interesting and gripping story, which ultimately gets to, I think, the answer to anxiety, which is that, the answer to anxiety is not that we medicate it away or we just pray it away. But the answer is by going through it, by actually going through anxiety as an experience of where we encounter our fears of abandonment and actually meet Jesus in it, not away from it or not around it, but in it, in our actual fears. And that's really a lot of what my new book, The Anxiety Opportunity, which is going to be coming out in May 15th. And listeners can go on Amazon now, actually, and pre-order it. But that's what that book is really about, is trying to engage the current narrative around anxiety and retell that story as actually it's a story where it's not a story that takes us away from God, but actually where we meet God through Jesus.
I thought that was really fascinating when I heard you talk about the fact that anxiety is not just a normal part of life, but an important part of life for our growth, and that the forgiveness and acceptance of going through it is part of our spiritual development and part of our witness to the world around us. We're supposed to take up the cross.
But Raymond, I think you've nailed it exactly, that, the dominant approaches to anxiety in the church today, I would say, are twofold. One, we either over spiritualize it and pray it away. This idea that somehow we are not supposed to feel anxiety, that it's a character flaw, a sign of lack of faith. Some traditions even call it a sin to be anxious. Sure. And so we're supposed to pray it away. Or another standard option is we're supposed to pill it away, right? We outsource it to secular mental health, to medicate it away or therapeutize it away. And while I my book talks about that there's a place absolutely for anti-anxiety medication, for therapy, these outsourcing to secular mental health approach ultimately despiritualizes the experience and does not actually provide a redemptive opportunity within anxiety. So these two opportunities, either we pray it away or we're outsourcing it to secular mental health to pill it away or therapeutize it away. Neither of these invites us to actually go through anxiety. They just push anxiety. They're telling us anxiety is a problem that we're supposed to make go away versus a doorway that we're supposed to go through. And that's really the biblical sort of vision and narrative around anxiety, that it's a doorway we go through and actually experience some of our deepest spiritual growth by actually going through it.
Do you take any time in this conversation, Curtis, to contrast the idea of anxiety versus the Lord's continuously repeated edict, do not fear? How do you contrast it? Do you talk about that at all?
Well, sure. I mean, why does Jesus need to keep saying, do not fear? Why does that, why does he have to keep saying that? It is actually one of his most repeated sort of encouragements. And I would say it's an encouragement, not a condemnation. He's not saying in that, if you fear, you're sinning. He's simply encouraging us to go down a path that ultimately leads to a liberation from fear. But I think the fact that he has to say that so many times is precisely an indication that he fully expects and experiences. He fully expects that our experiences are going to be tinged with fear, and therefore we need a response to that. And the response is to go through it. Like the way that we are freed from fear is by actually going through fear, if that makes any sense, right? So, and then the other thing that I would say is that it's important, really important, I think, to differentiate anxiety from anxiety disorders. So I make a claim that I think is, in my mind, clear in Scripture, that Jesus experienced in his human life. He experienced anxiety. I'm not saying he experienced anxiety disorders, right? So anxiety disorder is when our anxiety gets to a place where we become non-functioning.
How do you integrate your understanding of anxiety into the development of disciples?
Well, I think so much of our discipleship is around our anxieties. I mean, this is what our fears, our concerns, our worries, are natural things that occupy us. And so connecting, and this is why I wrote the book, The Anxiety Opportunity, is rather than thinking anxiety is a problem that we have to make go away first, and then we can get on with our spiritual life, our discipleship. My point of the book is anxiety is the very material. It's the very content. It's the doorway that leads us into discipleship, right? So it's not something we, again, pray away first and then get discipled, or outsource first and then we get discipled. It is the stuff of discipleship. And so, I think that's why I wrote the book, and why I think we need to think of and experiment with and practice discipleship strategies that actually engage people precisely in their anxieties.
Do you sense any differentiation across the boomer, millennial, X, and Z generations in the manifestation of anxiety that you talk about, or is it all homogenous?
No, I think it's very different anxieties. I think I can speak from my own personal experience that I think my anxieties growing up was much more around, will I succeed in this world? Will I establish my place in the world? I think my kids' anxieties are much more about, will they find belonging? Will they find acceptance? And so they're related, but they're different. So I think, I haven't done a deep dive on all the fine nuances, but I think every generation is shaped by a particular set of concerns that gives particular shape to their anxieties. I'm gonna give you an example. Even when we think about anxieties of the world, when I grew up, my anxiety about the world was it going to get obliterated in nuclear war, right? This was the height of the Cold War. And I remember, I can't remember what TV show it was. I think it was The Day After Tomorrow or The Day After. I can't remember. It was some TV show that showed the nuclear winter, right? I was like, oh my gosh, is that my future? Whereas my kids, it's much more about climate change. For them, it's much more of am I going to grow up in a world that increasingly is eroded in its environmental quality because of climate change? So again, I think it's just different. I mean, there's some obviously underlying threads, but they take different expressions.
As we begin to talk about some of what I would term the practicalities of discipleship, would you give us just a sense of what redeeming Babel is all about? Because the word anxiety shows up there in some of your mission conversation. Talk to us a little bit about why and what that is.
Yeah, so Redeeming Babel is a nonprofit that I started that really is trying to reform how Christians engage with the wider world. So it is not all encompassing of what discipleship is, because I think there's a lot of discipleship that has to do with your own internal life and your own relationships with your family and loved ones. We don't really cover that. We're really about trying to disciple Christians and how they relate to the wider world. Now, where anxiety comes in, because you would think, well, wait, so why are you dealing with anxiety? It's an internal psychic condition. The reason is because if you look at all the dysfunctional ways in which Christians are relating with the wider world, and I would put political polarization as an example of that, right? Or conspiracy, falling prey to conspiracy theories. And again, I would say this is true on the left and the right. There are left and right versions of polarization, of conspiracy theories, of a us versus them mentality. This is across the political spectrum. But on both the left and the right, you can't understand how we are so prone to polarization, to an us versus them mentality, to falling prey to conspiracy theories, unless you understand anxiety. Anxiety is the emotional engine of all of these different dynamics. And so if you just speak to the head and say, don't think that way, don't believe those things, but you don't speak to the underlying emotional drivers or why people are believing these things, why people are drawn to this us versus them mindset or to various conspiracy theories. You're just speaking to their head, and they're not going to actually go with you because you're asking them to basically abandon what they have, the crutch they have come to deal with their anxieties, right? And so they're like, I'm not going to let go of this crutch, because until you give them a better, more biblical way to deal with the underlying condition, the underlying handicap of anxiety. So that's why we deal with anxiety, is because it's the emotional driver behind so much of the dysfunction with how Christians are relating to the wider world.
We had Cherie Harder from Trinity Forum on last week, and what we posed to her was, how does discipleship, statesmanship, and citizenship fit together? It sounds to me, Curtis, your response, please, is that redeeming Babel is to a degree trying to deploy a statesmanship and a citizenship of the higher kingdom of Christ, the city of God, out into the world around us. Is that fair?
No, that's exactly right. And the way I would say it is, we're trying to get underneath at the foundational levels of formation, of the formation of the mind, heart, body, heart, soul, spirit, and action of peoples. And so, our three pillars of formation are at that interior level: anxiety, for all the reasons I just explained, because it's the emotional engine of our public engagement or public life. Then at the middle tier of our immediate sort of public life, we really offer a theology of institutions, because we think that's another missing pillar. Just like a biblical approach to anxiety is missing on the interior life, what's missing is a vision of life for Christians that involves institutions, involves participation in organizations, including secular organizations, and including fallen organizations, which are, by the way, are all human organizations. So we want to give people a theology of institutions and organizational life. And then at the higher level, at the broad sort of social political level, is a reframing of how Christians engage in politics. So anxiety, institutions, and politics, these are what we believe are the three formational streams that kind of are the deep undercurrents of how Christians engage with the world that we need to get underneath and reform and reshape. Because right now, I think in all three of those levels, in our approach to anxiety, our approach to institutions, and our approach to politics, there's deformation going on.
Folks, we are talking with pastor, professor, podcaster, author, Curtis Chang, who has a fantastic resume for this conversation on discipleship. And when we come back, we're going to explore the D-Combinator, and we're going to deep dive a little bit Curtis's ideas about how we go after all this. So stay with us. In 30 seconds, can you give two comprehensive examples of how we fix discipleship in the Western world? Or alternatively, as a pastor, where you've been in the trenches, as a guy who's been a campus minister with InterVarsity, as a guy who's been a professor in the seminaries and in the think tanks, What kind of a grade would you give our churches on macro theological education, community, and the individuation of disciple making? How would you kind of score those three things when we think about macro education, maybe from the pulpit, community development in the church, and this whole idea of how we get ones and twos together? What kind of grades would you give us?
I think I would give ourselves like a B plus in terms of educating the professional class, the clergy. I think we've got structures set up for that. I would
Okay.
give us probably like a D in terms of theological education of the masses, of the lay community. And this is where I think there's just been this big gap where the structures that we've set up for theological education have been so geared to the clergy and to academia. So what the professional theological education is, it does a decent job. It does probably like a B to B plus in educating the clergy. It does probably an A minus or an A for the academics, and that's kind of what it's been set up to do. But it's doing a poor job in terms of equipping the body of Christ, the larger body of Christ.
So you're sort of echoing Tim Keller's thematic about the demise of the main lines, the demise of the Protestant, the evangelical churches. You're kind of echoing the same sentiments here.
I think that's right. So.
You need to give us, I'll call it 30 seconds on the point that you just made on community. When you and your co-host David French on Good Faith Podcast talk a lot about Christianity, it's a community of tribalism with a very narrow and sort of vindictive, almost a Saul of Tarsus type of approach. Is that true? Does that capture what you're seeing in many communities?
In some, right? I mean, so I think there are a lot of churches that are fighting this, are trying to combat this, but it is the Christian, especially the evangelical church, is in danger, and many churches have fallen into this, of basically of confusing community with tribalism, right? So the community of Christ is the people of God gathered around across division. I mean, that is the vision of the body of Christ. It is where Jesus has reconciled all things, all divisions, right? Greek versus Jew, male versus female, Scythian versus, Jew, slave versus free, like all of the classic divisions that govern the first century life. Paul was very clear: the community of Christ, the body of Christ, is the community that is the big us, that actually overcomes all of these divisions, all of these us versus them lines. And we've got to realize the threat to the Christian church today is it's not really that if I mean, more than anything else, it is that we lose that vision of the us and that we ourselves get captive to various forms of us versus them, whether it's the us is defined as where the conservatives against the woke progressives, or where the progressives against the sort of extreme racist conservatives, however those lines are drawn. Once we fall into that line, once we allow the body of Christ to be captive by this us versus them mentality, we have fallen way short of the vision of community that is the biblical vision of community.
So now I want to really zero in, because I'm going to say some things and you can push back, but I want to really deep dive into this concept of the D-Combinator. And folks, just so you understand that's a white paper that Curtis wrote for his own local church, assessing his own local people in their local environment with the local dynamics that are going on there. However, I think he's got something that's got a lot more applicability in the church. Curtis, are you telling us, listening on this podcast, right? We're a bunch of thought leaders and change leaders, and we're folks who are involved in the development of the church. Are you seriously trying to tell me that if I'm a member of the church, I'm a member of a small group, I go on mission trips, I do my Bible study, haven't I checked the blocks, brother? I mean, come on, what is it you want out of me on the rest of this stuff? You wrote this white paper saying what?
Well, let's just go back to what is the Great Commission. Like, what is the Great Commission? It's not, so all you disciples go on mission trips. So all you disciples, pray a lot, or all you disciples read the Bible every day. All those things are good things. But the Great Commission is go and make disciples, like disciple making. That is the Great Commission. And so all of those other things that you're talking about are in the service of disciple making. We draw people into community, into small groups, so that they can be made disciples, because you can't really make disciples if you don't have community. So it's a prerequisite. It's a necessary ingredient. Disciple making happens in mission. So the point of mission trips is not just go on missions so you can check that box, because mission is a fantastic context to make disciples, right? It's in, as you get out of your ordinary context, you're facing challenges together, side by side. That's, it's been on mission trips that I've had some of the most profound conversations around discipleship, both being made a disciple and just making other disciples. So I would say disciple making is the big high category. These other activities are feeding into that, right? So it's this disciple making is not an add-on. It's not like another thing you have to add to the checklist. It's the big checklist, and the other things are like sub-items into it.
And I want you to talk to us just a little bit about what is it exactly you think the church's model in the paper you presented might be. And by the way, folks, listen, this is the Disciple Dilemma podcast. So if anybody's really offended by anything Curtis says, it's totally not our fault. It's totally his.
That's right.
So here, Curtis, is kind of the focus, right? It's like you're proposing that the church dare to do something using the trust that should be embellished and embedded in the church with two people to do something, which sounds to me like a violation of my rights. Would you please take us through that?
Yeah, again, I want to say, just emphasize, I'm not saying what I wrote in this paper is applicable in all contexts, all situations. It was for my church and my church context, but I think it does have something to say to other churches, in that it at least raises the question, well, what if mine doesn't apply to your church? What does? What is your strategy? What is your philosophy? What is your program on disciple making? Because if you tell me, well, we just think it happens organically and happens automatically, count me a skeptic. And so in our case, my point was just that, look, this isn't happening organically. This isn't going to happen automatically. The church needs to actually exercise its authority and do the job of matchmaking, and appoint people who have the track record, the fidelity, the spiritual maturity to be disciple makers, call them into that role, authorize them into that role, so that they don't have to just say, well, I don't know, am I a disciple maker? I don't know, that's arrogant, or I'm not sure I've got anything to offer. It's the church needs to be the one to say, no, you do. We've seen it. You're a person that needs to be making disciples. And then actually gather folks who they also identify as, wow, you're somebody that needs to be discipled, to actually take that step. Like, I think you need to be formed, and then do the work of matchmaking, and not only matchmaking, but that in terms of just like, okay, you put you together, then throw you on your own devices, but actually provide a structure, agenda, a content that structures the disciple-making relationship. We did it a particular way. There could be other ways that you can do it. Navigators has, for a long time has their own curriculum, or other, programs. So I'm not saying ours is the absolute right one, but you have to provide something, because otherwise, again, just the cultural streams make it so difficult. So, for example, one of this, the egalitarian culture. Like the American modern Western culture is so egalitarian that the notion that one person could actually have something authoritative to say and shape the other person cuts against so much of our egalitarian culture. And therefore, the church has to actually step in and authorize an inegalitarian relationship, because left by their own devices, it just doesn't happen.
So I want to just come back to the conversation we had a moment or two ago as we wrap this up. We talked about the ways that we may or may not be hitting it well in terms of developing good theology as an understructure of believers. We talked about that for a minute. We talked about community and some of the risks and rewards inside the community system. If you were going to grade most churches, I keep taking the professor back to grades, right? If you were going to grade most of the churches today on the idea of pairing up people as a biblical New Testamental model that Christ gave us, this is a significant part of the discipleship of an individual. What kind of grade would you give most churches based on what you know?
Oh man, you keep wanting to make me give bad grades here. I think we're failing. I think as a church we're failing. You need to finish this assignment. You need to start this assignment. And again, there's a lot of different models, strategies, but every church should be able to answer the question, what is your disciple making strategy? That's a question that you need to have an answer to. You can have your own different answers, but if you can't answer, if your answer is we put people in small groups, sorry, I think that I'm gonna give you an incomplete on that. If that's your answer. If your answer is we believe it just happens organically through relationships, I'm giving you an incomplete. So.
Professor and Pastor Curtis Chang, we are so grateful that you joined us today on the Disciple Dilemma. I just want to thank you before you say anything. I want to thank you for your ministry in the marketplace and in the media to get the word about who the followers of Christ are and ought to be. Thank you for what you've done, and thanks for being with us.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Raymond, thanks for being with us today.
Oh, I enjoyed it. And Curtis, it's a delight to talk to you.
Our thanks to Dr. Curtis Chang of Redeeming Babel for being with us today to talk about discipleship and his ideas, like the D-Combinator, about leaders taking the role to help drive discipleship back toward the model Jesus gave us. In the same way, please help us, folks. We need you to like and follow us on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Rumbly. We need to get back to the model of discipleship Jesus gave us. And as always, thanks for listening.